Culture and Agriculture, an ecological introduction to traditional and modern farming systems. Now, unfortunately, this book is out of print, and I've been trying to convince the publishers that they should reprint it because it's so important, but so far they haven't. But I have found that almost every library that I have checked has a copy of it, so if you haven't looked at it, you might want to take a look at it. But here's the thing that Ernest Shusky points out, and he's an anthropologist, and so the question which he asks is, how have we humans fed ourselves ever since we've been on the planet? And it's that story which then provides a historical context for us in our own time, and he in 1989 in his time. And I would argue that we now have some additional kinds of things that we have to anticipate, and I'll go into that in a minute. But so anyway, so he, as an anthropologist, he looks at this ever since we humans have been on the planet. How have we fed ourselves? And then he points out that we humans evolved on the planet, and we evolved in the life on the planet as the two-legged upright Homo sapiens that we are, roughly 200,000 years ago. And then he points out that for the first 190,000 years of those 200,000 years, we were not food producers, we were food collectors. We were hunter-gatherers. So we tended to live in small tribal groups like other species, and we would eat the plants that we found useful to us to feed ourselves and hunt the animals, and that's how we fed ourselves. So we were hunter-gatherers for that whole long period of time. And then the second evolution in that how we feed ourselves, which happened about 10,000 years ago, is when we did start to become food producers. We started to do agriculture. And the kind of agriculture which originally involved ourselves in is what he called the slash and burn agriculture. We started to live in larger societies, started to live in some more urban communities, and so we lived in these larger areas. And we would cut the perennial grasses or trees into place and then burn it, and then with the nutritious soil in that area, we could plant seeds and grow foods. And we started to identify animals that we particularly like to hunt, and we started to work toward domesticating them. And then when we could then grow food in this place that we slashed and burned, for probably 15 or 20 years, and then we start to deplete the nutritious soil, and then we'd have to slash and burn a new place. And then maybe 20 years later, we could go back to that original place and grow some food there again. But that's essentially how we fed ourselves, and for that, those first periods, that first period in that 10,000 year time, when we started to do agriculture. And then he points out that we then, in the early 1600s, we started to really relate to the whole of nature in a different way than we had before, because we had begun to use the resources that we had to produce as much food as we could. And then we began to recognize that doing that meant that we had to become more aggressive about it. And so we had to find ways to really control nature and dominate nature. And then in 1641, one of the first leaders in our time came up with the term that we had to become the masters and possessors of nature, and that became a view that people looked at and felt that they needed to. I need to get my notes here because I don't always remember all the names, but Rene Descartes was the person who first came up with that. We had to become the masters and possessors of nature. And so that meant that we had to become much more aggressive about how we control nature and how we make nature do what we want it to do in our own interest. And then Francis Bacon, about that same time, came up with another phrase that he called, we had to bend nature to our will, so that nature does what we want and what we need. And that's how we began to move things forward. And then in 1982, in Germany, a couple of people came up with a concept which they called the law of the minimum. So they were now already captured by this notion that we had to force nature to do what we wanted to do in our own interest. And this wasn't so much about agriculture at that time, it was the whole culture of how we relate to nature. And then in 1828, this notion became a part of the culture in Germany. It was called the law of the minimum. How do we get the maximum output for the minimum amount of input? That was the way to really dominate nature in an effective way. And then in 1840, and this is the important part, and is what then leads to a different way of feeding ourselves according to Ernest Schutzke. And that was that Justus von Liebig, who was also a German scientist, he decided to apply the law of minimum to agriculture. And so in doing that, he came up, which would be the minimum input in order to get the maximum output with the big three, the NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. And if you just put those three inputs into the soil, then you get a maximum output, and then you solve the problem. And that, of course, became a very popular kind of view, and the first, say, fertilizer factories to produce the NP and K started to be built just a couple of years after that. But most of the farmers were still involved in more of the manure management of the soils, et cetera, which they had been doing in the slash and burn period. And so they didn't really apply this NPK mentality, this law of the minimum, until after the Second World War. And what happened after the Second World War? During the Second World War, of course, many companies were munitions factories to provide the munitions for the war, and that's how they made their economic wealth. And the war was over, what were they going to do? And somewhere along the way, they discovered that what they could do is make these cheap fertilizers to make them available for farmers. And then, and I remember as a youngster growing up back then, cartoons in our local paper of a soldier walking with a bag of fertilizer over his shoulder up to a John Deere tractor operated by a woman, because during the war, of course, it was more women that were managing our farms because the men were off to war, walking up with this bag of fertilizer, convincing her that this is what she needed to do. And it was simply, right now you smile about that and we laugh about it, but that was part of, building that kind of culture. And that's then when and I remember my own father, who actually was very concerned about taking care of land, and he was concerned about how this fertilizer was going to affect his land. But then he became convinced and became one of the first farmers in our township in North Dakota to start using fertilizer. And then, of course, he saw the response from that, and then he became an advocate of fertilizer on our own farm back then. So that's how we entered into this. Now, the important thing about this then created a third era, according to the analysis of Ernest Schutzke, which he called the Neo Caloric Era, because all these inputs that we use are not renewable. And therefore, he says, we're going to use them up in a relatively short period of time. And so this Neo-caloric era is going to be the shortest period of time in the timeline of human history for how we do agriculture. Now, if you think about this, and this is now when we start thinking forwardly, this is one of the things I want us to think about today. if we think about this Neo Caloric Era, and where are we? And here's where I think another resource that if you haven't looked at, I would encourage you to take a look at, and that is David Montgomery's new book, Growing a Revolution, which he published just a couple of years ago. And he features 8 farms who are now farmers who are now, and only one of those farms is an organic farm, and that's the Rodale Institute. All the other farmers were conventional farmers. But they were farmers who began to realize that they were losing money with this input-intensive system because their input costs kept going up and the returns kept going down, so they were losing money. So they knew they couldn't do this anymore. So they, in their own way, on their own farms, began to do essentially 3 things. They reduced their tillage, they include cover crops, which of course restores the health of the soil, and they significantly enhanced the biodiversity of their system so that they would have more self-renewing kinds of approaches in their farming operations. And then they each started to make a profit. And according to David Montgomery's research, he claims that every one of these farmers now is no longer interested in getting bigger because that's not the solution to anything. What they're interested in is finding more of these biological dynamics which will make their farming operations more self-renewing and self-regulating. Now, when we start to think about the future, which is my responsibility here today, where are we? Where are we on this neocaloric era issue? And I would argue that these few farmers, which have already made this transition, are an indication that we are right there on the edge of the end of the neocaloric era. And if you look at all of the inputs that we're using and how we're depleting them and the costs are going up, and let me just as a farmer list 3 of those for you. And that's fossil fuels. Fossil fuels is the input that creates most of our nitrogen, of course provides all of our energy. Rock phosphate. Rock phosphate is what provides all of the phosphorus, which is the second part of the 3 NP and K issue. There are now only 4 countries which still have rock phosphate reserves. And rock phosphate is a natural evolution in the planet, just like fossil fuels are. And we've been using them up, so we've been depleting them. And experts who've been looking at our rock phosphate reserves are now telling us that at very best, we only have another 20 years of rock phosphate reserves, and maybe only as many as 10 years. Now, again, in the 1960s, farmers were buying phosphorus for $60 a ton. Now it's $700 a ton. And it's not hard to imagine that in another 10 years, it'll be $2,500 a ton. And of course, everybody knows that our fossil fuel reserves costs have gone up as well. Now, not as much as T. Boone Pickens, for example, predicted 20 years ago, because he felt that this was going to get depleted at a point where he said that we should recognize that in fossil fuels that we're going to be paying $350 a barrel for crude oil. Now, he did not know about the hydraulic fracking to get more of the fossil fuels, but nevertheless, we're still depleting the fossil fuels, and the cost will continue to go up. So if the fossil fuel costs go up and the rock phosphate costs go up, and then a third input that we use very much is our fossil water, because since we haven't paid much attention to restoring the health of soil, we need to have more irrigation water to provide moisture for the surface of the soil. We are now using 70% of our fresh water resources on the planet just for agricultural irrigation. And if you want one example, and I don't think you get irrigation water from the Ogallala Aquifer here, but throughout the Central Plains, that's where we get all of our irrigation water. And again, experts who've been looking at this are saying that we are draining the water resources in the Ogallala Aquifer at a rate where there's only going to be possible for agricultural irrigation for another 20 years and maybe only another 10 years. And again, already there are some farmers on the edge of the Ogallala Aquifer who can't get water for irrigation anymore, and the costs are going up. Now, what does this tell us about the end of the neocaloric era? And that's when we start to think about the future, that's what I want all of us to think about. And then what do we do about that? Well, it means that we really have to, and here's where thinking about organic agriculture is important, because as everybody in this room knows, there have been moments in organic agriculture when we have really stressed the importance of soil, and that it's the health of the soil which sustains, the production system. Now today, there's, as we all know, a big debate going on within organic where that's still kind of out there, and increasingly people, even in organic agriculture, are saying, well, that was yesterday's, we've got all these inputs now, and we're simply using natural inputs instead of synthetic inputs, and hydroponics and whatever, you name whatever the list is. But it's really an input-intensive system. And so if we're not going to have these cheap resources for this input, for this cheap input system, then we're going to have to think about how the future of organic agriculture is, how it's going to function. And this is where soil health becomes critical. And I want to share with you, a couple of resources out of this that I think are important to how we think about this in the future. And that is that, well, let me tell you, one other thing that I think is important is that Justus von Liebig, published his book about, that we need to just use the law of the minimum and just use these 3 NPK inputs. 20 years later, he published a second book in which he said that was the wrong direction. Because he said what we needed to really do is return organic matter to the fields to provide crops with a full complement of nutrients. So he already began to recognize that. But of course, by then, the concept of the NPK law of the minimum became so popular, I don't think most people didn't even read his book. but nevertheless, it's important, I think, to recognize that he was aware of that. Now, so if we are really reaching now the end of the Neo Caloric Era, how do we begin to think about the future? Well, here is where, right now, in almost every educational institution that I've been involved in that deals with agriculture, it's all about STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. And if you have those 4 skills, then you're going to be successful, whether you're a farmer or, agriculture manager or whatever. Science, technology, engineering, and math, because these are skills that will enable you to better improve the current system, right? And that's been our primary approach. And from my point of view, given what I've just mentioned about how we're moving now already beyond this neocaloric era where these inputs are no longer going to be possible, then how is science, technology, engineering, and math going to solve the problem? That doesn't mean that science, technology, engineering, and math doesn't play any role at all, but it's not the core role. We need to also develop skills in imagination and social relationships of working together with each other in our own communities and our own ecological neighborhoods. These are all skills that we're going to have to develop as we look into the future. So the alternative that, and again, we have a history here that goes back, early on. Sir Albert Howard, Liberty Hyde Bailey, Aldo Leopold, all kinds of people who recognized that this movement toward the input-intensive approach was not the future, that we needed to really think about a more, quote-unquote, regenerative, and it was J.A. Rodale who first came up with that term, a regenerative agriculture. And what he meant by regenerative was that everything that we use gets renewed in the process of using it. So it's how we put the system together that's important. And so it's the soil and the microbes in the soil, which are the life in the soil, which we know how to feed and which can then improve the quality of the soil and provide all of the inputs. And I shouldn't even use the term inputs, but provide the resources that we need in order to have an effective agricultural production. Now, there's one other kind of innovation, I think, that's taking place that's also worth looking at, and many of you, or maybe all of you, are horticulturalists, so this may not seem to apply to horticulture, and that's perennialization. And as you all know, about 35 years ago, Wes Jackson came up with this idea, that nature doesn't operate on the basis of annuals, operates on the basis of perennials, so why don't we perennialize much of agriculture so that we have perennials in the system? And, that's now, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done, and the Land Institute is continuing to do that, despite the fact that Wes is now retired. One of the examples I like to use about the success of the Carenza wheat, which is a perennial wheat that has been evolved in the Land Institute, is that Patagonia is now making a beer from the Carenza wheat. And if you haven't had any, it's some of the best beer we've ever had. And it's now so popular that they don't have enough Carenza to sell the beer throughout the United States. It's only available in California. But the goal is eventually to make the beer available throughout the United States. Now, I only mention that because there are also some quality issues here which may play a role as we move into the future on this. Nevertheless, the concept of regeneration, and you all know this, everybody wants to claim to be regenerative now because it's already becoming a popular term in the marketplace. And a lot of the claims of regeneration aren't, not in the original concept of J.I. Rodale, is that everything that we use gets renewed in the process of using it. But that's the ultimate goal. And here again is where soil is at the heart and soul of this. Because if we really restore the health of the soil so that the microbes in the soil provide all of the benefits from that, and then and we know this from experience, that it really does make the system self-renewing. I want to also, one of the other resources that I think are important, if you haven't gone back, is Sir Albert Howard, who actually published 2 books. The first one was an Agriculture Testament, in which he laid out his law of return and this whole concept of how we could produce our food in this self-renewing kind of way. And then a second book that he published a few years later is called The Soil and Health, where already back then he understood that there was a relationship between the food that we eat from healthy soil, which contributes to our health, a concept which is just now beginning to be recognized within the healthcare profession. And again, if you're interested in a couple of healthcare professionals who in fact have made this a part of their practice now, Daphne Miller, who is a healthcare professional in California. She runs a clinic in California, also teaches family medicine at the University of California. And she has discovered that when a patient comes into her clinic with some kind of health problem, and they had previously been getting pharmaceuticals to deal with their health problem, it didn't make them healthy, it just kept them from getting worse. And when she puts them on a diet of whole food from healthy soil, they actually become healthy. So that's one example. And one healthcare professional of our whole healthcare system, of course, is not something to celebrate yet, but the fact that it's happening at the ground level with particular. And then Maya Strateed Klein, who runs a children's clinic in the Bronx in New York, and she's discovered the same thing. And Daphne Miller published a book called Pharmacology, spelled F-A-R-M, and then how family farming can contribute to human health. And then Maya Strateed Klein also published a book called The Dirt Cure. And she points out that usually what happens when people's children become ill and they put them on some kind of pharmaceutical, which again keeps them getting worse, doesn't make them healthy, and then they hear about Maya Strateed Klein clinic, and they take their children to her clinic, and then she puts them on a diet of whole food growing in healthy soil, and in a matter of weeks they become healthy. So again, these are early, and the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health now has begun to recognize this as a kind of revolution beginning to take place in the healthcare profession. And so they're starting to do some research and moving in the direction of how we can move this way. Now, I want to also share with you, I copied this out, but in his Agriculture Testament on page 4, and if you haven't ever read this, you might want to look at this. Let me get back. Yeah. So, yeah, here it is. So, Albert Howard, he makes this point, he says, where he, in one paragraph, tries to describe what agriculture should be like. And he said, Mother Earth never attempts to farm without livestock. She always raises mixed crops. Great pains are taken to preserve the soil and to prevent erosion. The mixed vegetable and animal wastes are converted into humus. There is no waste. The process of growth and the process of decay balance one another. Ample provision is made to maintain large reserves of fertility. The greatest care is taken to store the rainfall. Both plants and animals are left to protect themselves against disease. Now that last statement, of course, is kind of radical for many people. Say, you mean we're just not going to deal with healthcare anymore? What he really means by that is that if they're on this kind of diet, then they don't become as ill. So it takes care of itself in a sense. So this is, the issue that I wanted to, as we look forward now. So the real question that we have, I think all of us, especially those of us involved in agriculture, whether we're farmers or whether we're, managers of agriculture systems or whatever, how do we begin to think about this new era now, which is the next era, the post-Neo Caloric Era, as Ernest Scusi pointed out? And how do we then do our agriculture in order to be productive and thriving in the future? And that's the central question. Now, there are a number of resources that, and I'm not going to take time because I want to leave some time for Q&A here. There are a number of resources that, and I can share them with you later if you want. But there's two particularly that I thought I want to spend a little bit of time mentioning to you. And one of those is a new booklet that Brian Swim and Mary Evelyn Tucker published back in, let's see, I put the date down here. I think it was 2012, called Journey of the Universe. And the reason that I think that book is so important is they point out that we humans who live on planet Earth and who feel like we're in charge and that we can force nature to do what we want her to do, we are totally ignoring the fact that we humans on this tiny planet Earth, was part of our little universe, is part of a much larger cosmos that we don't even fully understand yet. But what we do know is that the cosmos evolved over 14 billion years. And so they're saying our universe and our planet Earth and we humans are a part of that evolutionary process. And we have to begin to recognize that we are part of that. So we are not in charge, we are not in control. And that if we think we're in control, we're really kidding ourselves. And so we have to begin, so if that kind of culture begins to become part of our common way of thinking about, our place in the universe and in the cosmos, and that we have to really begin to try to understand how that evolution is taking place and how we then partner with that rather than trying to control that becomes then a productive future for all of us. So that's an important resource, and it's an easy read. And then the second resource that I want to call to your attention is even much more recent than that. And that's Timothy Weiss, who just published a new book in 2019 called Eating Tomorrow, the battle for the future of food. And he teaches at Tufts University. And I, quite by accident, came across his book. And I have to tell you that it's one of the most inspiring books that I've ever read, especially in terms of looking into the future. And what he really points out is that if we really take eating tomorrow seriously in all of its dimensions, we have some major changes in our own culture, in our own selves, in how we relate to nature and how we relate to each other, as we move into the future. So looking forward, I think his is one of the most important reads that you might want to take a look at, because I think it helps us all to understand where we are and what our opportunities and challenges are as we look into the future.